My first book of poetry is called First Will and Testament, and it came out in October of last year. It's been published from Writers' Workshop, who are very well known in promoting the first books of authors of poetry. And my poetry book actually is the result of at least 3 or 4 years of poetic labor. The poems have been written over a period of time, and it's been put together under 7 sections in the book. The sections deal with different aspects, I mean, some of which are very close to my heart. For example, there are sections specially devoted to classical music, especially Western classical music. There are sections devoted to painting, especially my favorite painters, to be very specific, Van Gogh. There are poems which are about the craft of writing itself, which has always fascinated me ever since I took up the pen to write. The way unconscious and conscious ways in which one gets into writing and then continues with the craft. This continuing relationship, and what comes out of that relationship is reflected in one section of poems which is called "And the Non-Chem Writer." And obviously there are some love poems, but which are not traditionally love poems, in the sense that there is this fixed subject, either a lover or the beloved, and it's a rendition of either melancholy or joy or anything of that sort. It is more a dramatized kind of a personae, a dramatist personae of different characters who go through several different experiences, and you can always understand that the poet is probably not the real narrator, I mean the real person over there. This is always somebody else. And the poet is somehow on the fringes, perhaps, commenting on things, looking at things, getting into it and then out of it. So it's very difficult. People have told me that my poetry generally is a bit, you might say, dramatic in that sense, because it has characters, lots of characters, and you cannot really place one poet who is behind everything. So, and he said that why is that so? But I believe that, right through this work, you will find a plethora of characters which I've created, points of view, voices, it's better to put it like that, voices which narrate different positions, which may be contrary to one another, and therefore contrary moral positions, contrary positions with regard to the way in which relationships, life, literature, poetry, music itself is kind of relished. But it offers you that perspective, that this is not just one poet speaking in one kind of monotonous single voice, but there are several characters, and it's very difficult to locate the poet who is hidden somewhere behind those several voices. So I think that's the way in which I presented my work. I've called it First Will and Testament because I've obviously played on the last will and testament, the phrase that we very commonly have, since this is my first work, which would suggest a very nicely incomplete corpus. I'm hoping that I can complete the testament one day, someday. So obviously it looks forward to, as well as other works which I hope I should be producing in some point in time. So I've called it very tongue-in-cheek, First Will and Testament. Yes, obviously different poems experiment with different forms over here. Formally, there is hardly the kind of rhymed patterns or the very structured rhymes that we would, for example, we read in 19th century English poetry, for that matter, which we grew up with reading. Even with early 19th century, early 20th century poetry. Mine is more like free verse, but there are a lot of internal rhythms, and there are some specific sudden bursts of rhyme which you might detect at certain very crucial moments in poems. So it's a very deliberate use of rhyme, but a very restricted use of rhyme that I have in my poems. And the voices are sometimes a bit more informal, sometimes they are kind of chatty almost. So there are different kind of guises that I use, and in one poem you have several cells, as I said, it's very difficult to pin it down to one particular personality, but my poems do ultimately say something, have something to present about points of view. Actually, I guess, as many poets say, the decision was, I think, made for me in some ways. It's only that I realized consciously a little later. The thing is that, I always grew up as a very introverted child, and in a very big family, it was very easy to get left out if you're not one of the you know, the outgoing one. So it happened that all my time, which was, I mean, spent, because I couldn't read. I was quite gregarious up to a point, but then I could not somehow get into, you know, communicating very well with people as others might have of my own age. So I took to doing something very interesting. I observed people, elders, it could be in my school, you know, mothers and fathers of students, fellow students, anybody talking among themselves. You know, what I did was I started developing a little dialogue in my own head, you know, so it's always like two people talking. So long after they'd gone, I'm kind of having those voices talking, a particular kind of talk. I was quite startled after a while to discover that these imaginary conversations were very precise, actually, because it had kind of got into their skins almost, and they were thinking about local color, the house, and everything else. And I said, very interesting. So I always seemed to lose my personality, and I used to get into other personalities. So after a while, I said that all I'm thinking of is somebody else, two completely anonymous people who were talking, let's say, on a bus, and I was just listening to their conversation, and now they get off. For the next half hour, I'm playing that conversation. I'm carrying it forward in my own head, imaginatively, possibly, this is how it might go. So again, I had these things. And the same thing happened with literary texts when I started reading a bit more, when I was in my 10th standard and beyond. So the same thing, I started fantasizing and doing things. And I tried slipping lines of poetry, obviously, which I thought might be interesting, while writing my English literature answers. And I was taken hauled over the coals by my English teachers, I remember that, and they have very fond memories of doing that to me now that I have got this first book out. So it was always like that, and then I said that why not consciously, you know, tap some of those conversations and ideas that I have, and let's see how it comes out. So without getting very formal, I started doing that, and as I said, just it was like a bet in school, you know, that we had Macbeth, Shakespeare's Macbeth, and you know, I said that, okay, this is a little bet, you know, you give me a tiffin that, you know, I can write a couple of lines and slip it into my answer, and the teacher will not be able to detect it's by somebody else. So it's two lines which are not there anywhere near Shakespeare, I can just slip it in. And so, you know, little things like that, it developed from there. And as I came into college, I started writing more, you know, consciously now. I was still learning the craft, obviously, and I still think I am. Because I think this is it's a kind of a lifelong apprenticeship, you know, you picking up things and fashioning things in your own way. I started reading, and some of the writers who I've come to love, people like Eliot and Larkin, and in addition to Wallace Stevens and obviously Pablo Neruda, a lot of writing from that on. And from there on, I kind of, my poems started unusually. It was a kind of strange thing, but people who read my poetry, to whom I showed my poetry, because I was very, again, very defensive about me writing and even showing it to my teachers or anybody else, maybe peers, you know, just showing their poetry. They said that it is rather mature. That's a comment they made. I did not consider myself to be at all a very mature person, the kind of definitions of maturity. And yet they said that what you write is very mature, you know, it's suggestive, you know, because, you know, early writing I've always found later on with a lot of young people is that it comes in gushes, you know, it's bound to be very kind of splashy, and sometimes the control that we talk about, you know, later on we talk about harnessing the medium that much better in whether it's prose or poetry, that comes a bit later, but, you know, very strangely, I don't know how, my lines used to come out that much better. So it was a kind of vote of confidence, and I went on from there. I started publishing in different journals, first in India and then abroad, obviously. I was asked to send my poetry abroad, and I got published in journals like Moving Worlds, and also I think In Capture, and several journals coming out of UK largely, because I got to know a few people from there, and they were very appreciative and very they kind of promoted my work, and they encouraged me to write more and regularly kind of send them their work. So it's after a long while coming out of university and then getting into teaching myself. I teach English literature at a college, so it's then that I started thinking at all about a book. And they said that now you should have a book. You have written enough, and I think you've pondered over your poems enough. So it's time that you brought out a book by itself. And the next big problem was finding a publisher. And somebody just said that you go to writer's workshop. You can struggle with your second book and your third book, but the first book must come out of writer's workshop, because I still believe that they are the best kind of publishers for first books. And yes, I read up a little bit of literature on the net and otherwise as well. And it was like a veritable who's who about Indian writing in English, especially Indian poetry. From Jayanta Mahapatra to Vikram Seth to Ruskin Bond, and they're all there. So it's wonderfully inspirational to get published by Writers' Workshop with my first work of poetry. And Professor Anandulal, who heads Writers' Workshop right now, was again very supportive and very appreciative in his comments. And they brought out this book, quite wonderfully actually. Very meticulous in their work, and I'm very happy that it's such a beautiful cover, and hopefully they believed in me. So I guess this is the beginning of the Odyssey. When you read my poems, at least in this volume, it will seem rather cosmopolitan, because as I said, poems about a painting by Van Gogh, poems about sonata by Franz von Bieber, and poems about living in Kolkata. I mean, and there are several others I'm not mentioning right now, but there are several other different kinds of poetry. Once again, we talk about post-colonial literature and theory, and my great friend for many years now, at least, I think for 7 or 8 years I've known him, Professor Bill Ashcroft. He said that, I've been talking about it for, ever since Empire Writes Back came out. So everybody, I'm the post-colonial man, wherever I go, I'm kind of mobbed by people and say that, tell us about that. And once again, I said, why don't you read books other than Empire Writes Back? For example, my book called Post-Colonial Transformation, where I've talked about the metamorphosis of post-colonial theory. It's something quite different right now. His positions have quite changed from the days of late 1980s, 89, 90, when Empire Writes Back came out. So post-colonialism is not, as I said, I think he wonderfully put it this afternoon when he was in a session. He said that it's not a theory of everything. So that's the mistake that you make, and it's again just a reading tool. It has nothing to do with forcing writers to write a particular kind of fiction or poetry. It's all about the new kind of literature coming out of these places like India, and we needed to find new tools in the West to read it, because we could not use those old tools about Victorian literature and about European literature and apply them blindly to writing coming out of India or other Commonwealth countries, erstwhile Commonwealth countries. So with me, the local influences, you might say, it's not directly reflected in the poems. Maybe in some poems you will find it. My travels are important. There are some poems are about travel and places to which I've gone. Others, obviously, indirectly, and you might find being influenced by the stories that I've heard about my own lineage, my ancestors, because again, that's a very interesting thing, because like many Bengalis, I think, it's a case of what we call our real homeland, what we call home in terms of my family's history, is now in Bangladesh. It's in the Rajshahi district. We come from a place called Faridpur, which is now in, I did manage to go to Rajshahi about 3 years back. I had gone to an academic conference in Dhaka, and I said that I would make a point of, my father said, if possible, could you please come and tell us what it's like right now. Even my father was born in Calcutta, but my uncle, my father's elder brother, he was born over there. So, when I grew up, it's with stories about those places. And I was telling somebody that there was these very strange stories about, medicine men actually ministering to patients who have communicable disease mid-river. So it's neither on the one bank nor on the other bank. The boats would come, take this man in one boat, and the medicine man would come in another boat, and the treatment would happen mid-river, so that because it would otherwise spread communicable disease on both banks. So, and the man would remain quarantined mid-river for the entire tenure of his treatment. So again, these strange stories which I picked up when I was a child, that every house had a boat, and you could, if you had to go from one neighbor's house to another neighbor's house, you actually went by boat, because for almost 5-6 months, everything would be underwater, especially post-monsoon, right up till the dry season, in probably November, December, right after the pujas. So even during pujas, you had people going by boats to each other's houses. So again, fascinating story. So I guess I grew up with that, and I had, again, a couple of very interesting, let's put it this way, ancestors, one of whom had converted to Christianity, and who was therefore in those days excommunicated from the family, to the extent that people would not talk about him in the family. And I used to coax my great aunts, please tell me about that, because it seemed fascinating. He had a wonderfully varied life, let's put it this way. He went off, apparently that's the information that my family has got. One of my great aunts reluctantly told me that he went off somewhere to the north of India, probably Allahabad or some place in Uttar Pradesh, they're not very sure about, because they did not even want to keep any contact with this man. And he had died somewhere over there probably. The news of his death had come. He died quite early, I think in his very early 40s. He was my grandfather's younger brother, actually. So 39 or 40 he died. And there was another one, even earlier in the family's history. The brother of my grandfather's father, he was again unmarried, and he went off to some country in Scandinavia. Again, my parents or even my great uncle did not have too much information, and I really want to kind of someday follow it up. He went off to Scandinavia and he became a writer of children's stories over there. Now, I don't know, I have never explored that, but it's extraordinary. And he said, and it was said that he had sent postcards from there saying that he's quite popular. So I don't know, but it was all there, these stories, little stories. I don't know if they influenced me to become a writer or become a poet later on, but these were always there, germane stories. So writing and these kinds of things were always there, and probing very characters who are on the periphery, characters about which families and societies do not want to talk too much about. That again was, what you might call the loser's point of view, or the ostracized point of view, or the marginal's point of view. In not so many, in the sense that he's actually marginal by some diktat of society or fiat of society, but marginal in the sense that his sensibility is somehow neglected. The words, the voices of his sensibility are somehow very, very prudently and very efficiently they're shuffled into some kind of a corner. I've found that I've always found, even reading European literature later on as a student, I've always found that I would always sympathize and probably, almost unconsciously take up the cudgels in favor of those characters and probably start imagining again situations, So that has reflected in my poetry, I think, my work. And probably will, even with what I do next, I guess.